He was a millionaire CEO with the world at his feet, but every night he sat alone in his penthouse office, staring into the Denver skyline, haunted by a silence no amount of success could fill. She was a former nurse turned quiet secretary, hiding a grief of her own, just trying to survive each day without falling apart. They were strangers, until one winter afternoon when his elderly mother, lost and confused, wandered into the office lobby in nothing but a nightgown, holding a single photograph. That moment would change everything. What happens when the walls we build to protect ourselves become the very cages we can't escape from? How does a man learn to love again when he's forgotten what love feels like, and can one simple act of kindness, not grand, not loud, truly rewrite the course of two broken lives? This is the story of Matthew Callahan and Claire Monroe, of a forgotten room, a mother's quiet wisdom, and a love that found its way through silence, grief, and second chances. If this story touches something in you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin. Everyone envied Matthew Callahan, but no one ever saw the way he sat alone in his penthouse office, watching the city lights like they might answer the silence left behind by grief. Each evening, after most employees had gone home and the building settled into its familiar hush, Matthew would stand at the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Denver. The world below moved with its usual rhythm, cars threading through traffic, restaurant lights flickering on, distant laughter drifting up from the streets, but none of it reached him. His thoughts lived elsewhere, in a space no skyline could touch. At 44, Matthew had built an empire out of creativity and control. Callahan Design Group was his legacy, born from a sketchbook and an endless drive to create beauty from structure. People called him a genius, a perfectionist, a visionary. But those who worked closest with him used words like distant, sharp, and untouchable. They weren't wrong, not anymore. 2 years had passed since the accident. His wife, Elena, had been driving back from a friend's baby shower just outside Boulder. A rain-slick highway, a moment of hydroplaning, a collision with a truck. The news came like a blow to the chest, sudden, shattering, final. In the days that followed, Matthew didn't cry, he didn't scream or throw anything. He simply stopped speaking more than necessary. He never moved out of their home, but he rarely returned before midnight. He left her studio untouched, still filled with canvases she never finished and paintbrushes she forgot to clean. Even her coffee mug remained by the sink, chipped on one side, lipstick mark fading with time. At the office, he became a man of structure and silence. He demanded more, talked less, and trusted no one with the chaos of his heart. His office at the top floor of the Art Deco building, once a space of innovation and laughter, had become a sanctuary of solitude. Clean lines, muted colors, and nothing personal, except for 2 photos on his desk, one of him and Elena, and another in a silver frame, face down. No one dared ask. Matthew's days were tightly scheduled. Mornings started with black coffee and a 10-minute review of architectural submissions. Lunch was usually skipped or replaced by a protein bar. Meetings were short, efficient, and emotionally sterile. He operated like a machine until something shifted. It began on a Tuesday. She arrived just before Ada. Holding a folder tucked under her arm and a reusable coffee cup in the other. Claire Monroe, 36, recently hired as his new executive assistant. She was calm without being cold, attentive without being overly eager. Her resume spoke of high-level organization and previous executive support. What it didn't say, but Matthew would later learn, was that before corporate life, Claire had spent almost a decade as a hospice nurse. He noticed small things first. She didn't flinch when he barked a correction, didn't shrink when he challenged her edits to a client proposal. She adjusted her pace to match his rhythm without making it seem like compromise. She knew when to speak and when to remain quiet, rare traits in an environment that rewarded loud efficiency. Most surprising of all, she brought him coffee without being asked. Ethiopian dark roast, with just a splash of oat milk, the exact way Elena had prepared it. At first, he assumed it was coincidence. Then, he wondered if someone had told her. But after 3 days of watching her work, careful, consistent, and unassuming, he realized she hadn't asked anyone. She had simply observed there was something else. Too, a way she looked at him not with sympathy, but with a quiet recognition, as if she understood grief not from books, but from living with it. She never asked about his wife, never even glanced too long at the photo. And yet, somehow, she made the office feel less like a mausoleum and more like a place where breath was still allowed. Matthew didn't know what to make of her. He told himself it didn't matter. She was just another assistant, here to do a job. But something about Claire lingered, like the scent of lavender she wore clean, subtle, grounding. That evening, after most lights had dimmed and the cleaning crew had started their rounds, Matthew sat at his desk reviewing a blueprint. He glanced up, rubbing his eyes, and saw Claire across the room. She wasn't working. She wasn't rushing to leave. She was just looking specifically at his desk, at the 2 frames. He froze, watching her. She didn't reach for them. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if the story behind the face-down photo could be read through the silver backing. She held her coffee cup in both hands, her posture relaxed but thoughtful. Matthew wanted to speak, to tell her something, anything to break the strange stillness between them. But he didn't. He just waited. Claire finally turned, met his eyes briefly, and offered a nod. Not one of intrusion, but understanding. Then she left the room without a word. He looked down at the photo she had seen, but never touched. Then, slowly, for the first time in months, he turned the frame face up. It was a picture of his mother. Claire Monroe never raised her voice. She didn't need to. People listened to her the way they listened to old songs. They didn't always understand why, but they felt something. She moved through the hallways of Callahan Design Group, like wind through tall grass, unseen by most, but gently shaping the rhythm of the place. She wasn't flashy or loud. Her wardrobe was modest, soft sweaters, tailored pants, sensible shoes. Her hair, chestnut brown, with hints of silver at the temples, was usually pulled back in a low twist. Practical and neat. There was nothing about her that screamed for attention, but people noticed her anyway. Or, rather, they noticed how they felt around her, steadier, somehow. Claire lived in a quiet part of Wheat Ridge, just west of Denver. A little one-bedroom cottage with creaking floorboards and a porch swing she'd never gotten around to oiling. The backyard had a stubborn rosebush she hadn't had the heart to dig up, even though it only bloomed once every few years. The house had belonged to her parents before they retired to Arizona. She kept it because it felt like somewhere you could breathe. It had been 15 months since her sister, Lydia, passed away. ALS doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't slow down just because you beg it to. Claire had spent 3 years watching Lydia fade, first her voice, then her hands, then the brightness behind her eyes. She'd been Lydia's nurse, caretaker, best friend, and when Lydia was gone, Claire found herself suspended in a kind of stillness. Not numb, not devastated, just still. Like a pond after the last ripple disappears. She hadn't planned on changing careers. Nursing was more than a job. It had been her way of holding the world together. But after Lydia, she couldn't bear the sterile hallways, the beeping monitors, the way everything always smelled faintly of antiseptic and loss. She needed space, mental, emotional, physical. That's when she stumbled upon the posting at Callahan Design. Executive assistant to CEO. High pressure, high level, high expectation. It should have scared her off. But something about him felt right. She had watched Matthew Callahan from afar before applying. Not in a fan-like way, but with the eyes of someone trained to observe. His interviews revealed a mind that moved quickly, precisely, but always with a thread of melancholy. His designs were beautiful, yes, but they were also controlled, almost too perfect, like someone trying to build order out of chaos. She understood that kind of effort. During her interview, he'd barely looked at her, asked a few pointed questions, tested her memory, timed how long it took her to answer a calendar conflict. He didn't ask about her past in healthcare, didn't smile once, and then, at the end, he simply said, "You start Monday, 8 sharp." That had been 6 weeks ago. Since then, she had become something of a fixture, quiet, dependable, unbothered by the frayed tempers and impossible deadlines that came with working at the top. She brought him coffee just the way he liked it, never interrupted him unless absolutely necessary, kept the office humming with a kind of invisible grace. Other employees noticed. "She's the calmest person I've ever met," someone whispered near the copy machine. "I heard she used to be a nurse. That's why nothing rattles her. She's like emotionally Teflon." Claire heard none of it. And if she had, she wouldn't have cared. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here because the silence after grief had become too loud, and she needed a different kind of quiet. There was one person, however, who did notice, though he never said a word. Matthew had started leaving his office door cracked, not wide open, just enough to let her voice drift in when she answered calls, or to catch the soft click of her shoes as she passed by. It wasn't intentional, at least that's what he told himself. That Thursday afternoon, the rhythm of the day was interrupted. Claire had just returned from lunch, a quiet half hour sitting in the small park behind the building, watching squirrels fight over an apple core when she sensed a change in the air. She stepped back into the executive hallway and saw Matthew standing in front of his desk, phone pressed to his ear, shoulders unusually tense, his jaw tightened, his voice dropped. He didn't raise it, but something in his tone felt raw. Then, suddenly, he ended the call mid-sentence, grabbed his coat, and walked out without a word. It wasn't like him. Matthew didn't rush. He didn't leave without giving direction. And he certainly didn't look like that unmoored. Claire stood in the hallway for a moment, hands still resting lightly on the edge of her laptop bag. Then she stepped into his office, almost unconsciously, and looked around. Everything was as always precise, orderly, composed. But the atmosphere had changed. Her eyes drifted to the desk. There were 2 framed photographs. One was of Matthew and a woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, clearly his late wife. Claire had seen it before, though she never lingered on it. But next to it, partially obscured by a stack of documents, was another framed silver, slightly worn at the edges. This one was face up now, where it hadn't been yesterday. It showed an elderly woman in a blue cardigan, seated on a wooden bench in what looked like a garden. Her smile was soft, but her eyes were distant, like she was already partway between here and somewhere else. Claire exhaled slowly. She knew those eyes. She'd seen them in hospital wings, in home care visits, in the mirror on bad days. That wasn't a photo you framed unless you missed the version of the person who once looked at you with recognition. She didn't touch the frame. She didn't rearrange anything. She just straightened the nearby papers, set a clean notepad beside them, and returned to her desk. By 6:30 p.m., the office was nearly empty. The hum of printers and murmured conversations had faded. Most of the staff had gone home. The cleaning crew wouldn't arrive for another hour. Claire checked her watch. Then, without moving, she opened her email and began replying to messages that could have waited until tomorrow. Some part of her stayed behind, not out of obligation, but instinct. If Matthew came back tonight and something told her she wanted to be there. It was just another Tuesday until the police showed up with an elderly woman who thought the lobby was her front porch. Claire had just returned from refilling her tea in the staff kitchen when she heard the sliding doors open and a strange shift in the receptionist's voice rising. Urgent, confused. "Ma'am, please, you can't just sit there. Ma'am, where's your family?" By the time Claire reached the front desk, she saw 2 uniformed officers standing awkwardly near the entrance. Between them, on the lobby couch, sat an elderly woman wrapped in a sky blue bathrobe, slippers on her feet, and a faded handbag clutched to her chest like something precious. Her white hair was gently curled, though slightly flattened on one side, as if she had gotten up from a nap and wandered off before remembering to finish getting ready. Her eyes were wide but clouded, scanning the marble floors and glass walls like she couldn't quite make sense of the space around her. In her lap was an old photograph. Claire's breath caught before she knew why. The receptionist whispered. She just walked in, said this was home. The officers found her on Broadway alone. No ID, just that picture. Claire stepped forward slowly, her hands visible and relaxed. "May I?" she asked softly, gesturing toward the couch. The woman looked up at her. Her face was elegant beneath the confusion, with high cheekbones and delicate lines carved gently by time. Claire knelt down. "Hello? My name is Claire. Can you tell me yours?" There was a pause, the kind that seems to stretch and thin the air. Then the woman's voice, faint but certain. "Evelyn. Evelyn Callahan." The name settled like a hush across the lobby. Claire's pulse quickened. Callahan? She glanced at the photograph. It was Matthew, much younger, laughing, sitting on the grass with a woman who looked like Evelyn, but stronger, sharper. He must have been in his early 20s before the weight of the world began pressing into his posture. Claire turned to the officers. "Thank you. I'll take it from here." They hesitated. "She's technically a missing person, came from a care facility in Cherry Creek. They're sending someone now, but traffic's a mess." Claire nodded, then turned back to Evelyn. "This is a big place. Easy to get turned around." "Huh?" Evelyn blinked at her, then smiled. "I thought I was going home, but the porch looks different." Claire didn't correct her. "Would you like some tea while we wait? My desk is just upstairs. It's quiet there." Evelyn looked at her suspiciously. "Do I know you?" Claire smiled. "Sort of. I'm a friend of your son's." It wasn't exactly true, but it wasn't exactly a lie either. Evelyn seemed to consider it. Then, with surprising grace, she stood and reached for Claire's arm. "Well, if you're a friend of Matthew's, I suppose that's all right." The receptionist still looked rattled. Claire gave her a reassuring nod and led Evelyn toward the elevators. Up on the top floor. The executive suite was empty, just the hum of after-hour silence and the soft echo of their footsteps on the tile. Claire guided Evelyn gently into the small lounge area adjacent to Matthew's office. It had a love seat, a coffee table, and a narrow window with a view of the city. The sky outside was shifting to that dusky lavender that Denver wore just before the lights came on. Claire fetched a mug, added chamomile tea and a touch of honey, and set it before Evelyn, who was now thumbing through a dog-eared paperback from the shelf behind her. "You know," Evelyn said thoughtfully, "Matthew used to bring me drawings when he was little. Skylines, buildings, things he imagined. I kept every one." Claire smiled. "He must have been a thoughtful boy." "Too serious," Evelyn said, chuckling softly. "Even at 6, he had that furrow between his brows, like he was already worried about deadlines." Claire sat across from her, watching as Evelyn's hands moved with surprising steadiness. Turning the pages of the book she couldn't quite read anymore. That's when she heard the elevator ding. The door to Matthew's office opened sharply, his footsteps quick and clipped as he entered the hall. He stopped. For a long moment, he simply stood there, briefcase still in one hand, coat unbuttoned, breath shallow. His eyes locked on the scene before him. His mother, sitting on the love seat, a steaming mug beside her. Claire leaning slightly forward, speaking gently, her posture calm but alert. His mother in his office. Claire turned her head toward him, but didn't rise. "Evening?" she said, as though this were the most natural thing in the world. Matthew didn't move. "I got a call," he said eventually, voice low, from the facility. "They said she wandered off." Claire nodded. "The police brought her here. She had your photo. This is where she was trying to go." He stepped forward slowly, finally setting down his briefcase. His gaze flickered between Claire and Evelyn, then back again. "She looks better," he murmured. "She's had tea. And someone to talk to." He didn't respond right away. Then Claire said, gently, "Would you consider letting her stay?" Just for tonight, Matthew blinked. The room was quiet except for the faint rustle of wind against the tall glass windows. He looked at his mother, her face peaceful now, her eyes less cloudy, less frightened. Then he looked at Claire. Something about her expression quiet, firm, kind made it impossible to argue. And for the first time in a long time, Matthew Callahan didn't reach for a decision with logic or efficiency. He simply nodded. She turned an old storage room into something that felt like Sunday mornings and warm hands. It hadn't been used in years. Room 12C was tucked away at the far end of the 12th floor, once intended as a small executive meeting space, then converted into overflow storage, and finally forgotten behind a door no one noticed anymore. But Claire noticed it. The morning after Evelyn's unexpected visit, Claire arrived at the office earlier than usual, before the hum of printers and the tap of keyboards filled the hallways. Before anyone noticed what she was doing, she had asked the night janitor for the key. He didn't ask why. People rarely questioned Claire, not because she demanded silence, but because her presence seemed to carry a quiet authority, like someone who always knew exactly what needed doing, and did it with both hands and her whole heart. The room smelled of old wood and carpet glue. Sunlight filtered in through a narrow window, casting a golden square of light across the floor. Dust hung in the air, suspended like forgotten time. Claire stood in the center for a moment, taking it in. Then she got to work. She brought in a small armchair from the break room downstairs, the one no one ever sat in, but everyone agreed was too nice to throw out. She covered it with a soft knit throw blanket, faded green, like spring moss. She retrieved an old kettle and mug from her own apartment, then added a jar of chamomile tea leaves wrapped in brown paper. On a narrow table near the window, she placed a porcelain vase holding eucalyptus and dried lavender. The air began to smell of memory and calm. A photo of a young Matthew and Evelyn went on the dresser. Next to it, a copy of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, its spine soft from decades of turning. Claire didn't rush. She moved slowly, as if speaking a language without words. When she finished, the room looked nothing like a storage space. It looked like home, or at least the corner of home that lived in someone's heart long after the real one had gone. That evening, Matthew stood in the doorway, looking around without stepping in. He said nothing, but Claire could feel the weight of his silence, could see the flicker in his eyes, not quite approval, not quite disbelief. He stepped inside at last, his gaze lingering on the photograph. "She used to read me Whitman before bed," he said quietly, "even when I said I was too old for bedtime stories." Claire smiled softly. Then it felt like the right book. Evelyn arrived a few minutes later, escorted gently by Claire, who had gone to pick her up from the facility herself. The nurse had mentioned that Evelyn had refused lunch. When asked why, she only said, "Claire promised tea." She remembered. Evelyn's face lit up when she saw the room. "Oh, this is lovely," she whispered, her voice full of wonder. "Did you do all this?" Claire shook her head, but smiled. It just needed a little dusting. Evelyn took her time walking around, fingers brushing over the edge of the table, the back of the chair, the book on the windowsill. She didn't question where she was or why she was there. She simply sat down, as if she'd always belonged. Matthew stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, trying not to look like he was watching too closely. But he was. Every movement his mother made was tracked in his periphery, each blink, each breath. That constant tension in his shoulders never quite left. Claire moved gently through the space. She filled the kettle, folded Evelyn's scarf, lit a small battery candle by the window. Every action was deliberate, unhurried. Later, as evening settled in, Evelyn grew drowsy. Claire sat near her, opened Leaves of Grass, and began to read softly, her voice like the low wind before a summer rain. She read the poem slowly, honoring each word, letting them bloom in the quiet. "I believe in you, my soul. The other I am must not abase itself to you, and you must not be abased to the other." Matthew stood by the window, arms folded, watching not her, not his mother, but something in between, watching the space between past and present collapse into something tender. Evelyn's eyes fluttered closed before the second page. Her breathing deepened, lips parting in sleep. Her hand still rested on the edge of the blanket, fingers curled like a child's. The room was still. Claire didn't move immediately. She set the book down gently, folded the blanket up to Evelyn's shoulders, checked the temperature of the tea. Matthew remained where he was. Finally, he spoke, barely above a whisper. "How did you know to do all this?" Claire looked at him. Her face was soft, unreadable in the golden lamplight. She didn't answer. She just smiled, and that, somehow, was enough. At first, they whispered behind closed doors. By the third week, they were bringing Mrs. Callahan cookies. No one said it out loud, not at first. They simply exchanged glances when they passed the 12th floor hallway. Voices dropped to a hush near the door of room 12C. Some frowned, some raised eyebrows. A few, especially from the legal team, muttered words like liability and inappropriate precedent. But no one dared bring it up with Matthew. The company handbook didn't have a section for what to do when the CEO's mother, who happened to have dementia, moved into a spare room beside the executive lounge. By the second week, things began to shift. The receptionist, Naomi, left a bouquet of daisies at the door one morning. Unsigned, James, the operations manager with a reputation for being emotionally tone-deaf, offered to install a softer overhead light in Evelyn's room, just in case the fluorescents are too harsh. By week 3, a quiet miracle had taken root. It wasn't just that people had adjusted to Evelyn's presence, they had begun to look for her. She sat near the window most mornings, wearing a different shawl each day, some crocheted, some knit, all soft and full of faded stories. She never asked for attention, but somehow, people stopped by anyway. She complimented neckties, remembered people's names, or pieces of them calling a new intern Mikey because he reminded her of someone she once knew, back when jukeboxes still cost a dime. She had a particular fondness for Lauren, the marketing assistant, who wore vintage brooches and always brought peppermint tea. Evelyn would hold Lauren's hand and say, "You look like someone who reads poetry out loud to their plants." Lauren had cried in the elevator after that, not because it was odd, because it was true. Claire remained in the background through it all. She adjusted Evelyn's medications quietly, met with a part-time nurse on Thursdays, kept careful notes in a leather-bound planner no one else ever touched. She rotated music playlists Debussy in the morning, Ella Fitzgerald in the afternoon, and made sure Evelyn's lunch was never the same 2 days in a row. She did it all without fanfare. To Claire, care wasn't something you performed. It was something you were still. The moment everyone remembered happened on a rainy Thursday. The sky had been the color of a bruise all morning. Half the staff had shown up late. The parking garage had flooded, and the new proposal for the Westbrook client had hit another delay. A junior graphic designer named Shelby, barely 23, smart as a whip, but still soft around the edges, had run to the bathroom crying after being scolded by her team lead. Evelyn found her, not in the bathroom, but sitting quietly on a bench near the break room, red-eyed and still holding a coffee cup she hadn't drunk from. No one saw how Evelyn knew. She simply walked over, sat beside Shelby, and took her hand in both of hers, thin fingers wrapped around trembling ones. And then, she said it. "You're doing better than you think." It wasn't loud, wasn't rehearsed, but it echoed through that floor like a hymn through cathedral rafters. Shelby later said she couldn't remember much else about the moment. Just that after Evelyn said it, she believed her. For the first time in weeks, later that day, someone left a tin of oatmeal raisin cookies by Evelyn's chair. No note, but Claire smiled when she saw them. They were Shelby's favorite. By then, even the skeptics had softened. Evelyn became something unspoken in the company culture, part mascot, part matriarch, part mystery. She didn't interfere with business. She didn't even know half of what the company did, but somehow she became essential. The 12th floor, once known for its silence and executive tension, began to change. Meetings ran 5 minutes longer, not out of inefficiency, but because people laughed more. Birthdays were remembered, coffee breaks lingered. Someone brought in a puzzle table and left it outside Evelyn's room. Within days, half the staff had added a piece. And Matthew started coming in earlier. Not much at first, 15 minutes, then 30. No one commented, but Claire noticed. He'd pause near room 12C each morning, eyes searching for a glimpse of his mother before walking briskly to his office. Sometimes he didn't even go in. He'd just stand nearby as Claire helped Evelyn into her chair, or reminded her how to play a simple card game, or adjusted the radio dial to avoid static. He didn't say much, but he stayed longer. One morning, he brought a blueberry muffin from the corner cafe Evelyn used to love. He left it on her side table without a word. That afternoon, Evelyn turned to Claire and whispered, "He still remembers what I liked, even after all the noise." Claire's heart caught a little at that. The noise. It was a good word for what grief leaves behind. Some things are too heavy to throw away. So, we tuck them in drawers and pretend we've moved on. Claire wasn't looking for anything when she found the photo. She had simply opened the drawer to organize Matthew's clutter, the one beside the filing cabinet where he kept unopened pens, backup chargers, and a strange assortment of paperweights no longer in use. The drawer resisted slightly as she pulled, not locked, just stiff, the kind of drawer that hadn't been opened in a while, and didn't particularly want to be. Beneath a stack of client proposals and a half-used notebook, she saw the edge of something soft, a worn envelope, yellowed at the corners. Inside, it was a single photograph. Claire paused. It was of a woman standing in a field of sunflowers. Her dress was pale blue, caught mid-movement by the breeze. One hand shielded her eyes from the sun. The other held a bouquet of wildflowers, messy, beautiful, unarranged. Her hair was loose, her smile soft and wide, like she was laughing at something just out of frame. Claire didn't need to ask who she was. She didn't stare. She didn't read the date stamped in fading ink on the back. She simply exhaled, gently returned the photo to its envelope, and slid it back where it came from. Then she closed the drawer with both hands, carefully, respectfully. That afternoon, she made the tea hotter than usual, stronger, Earl Grey with a touch of clove warming, grounding, the kind of blend one chooses when the weather shifts, or when the soul needs anchoring. She set the cup on Matthew's desk without a word, then turned to leave. But he was already watching her. He hadn't looked up when she walked in, but now his gaze followed her with the weight of knowing. Not accusatory, not defensive, just quiet, exposed. Claire met his eyes for a moment longer than necessary, and in that silence, something passed between them. Not a confession, not a confrontation, just an understanding. She didn't ask about the photograph. He didn't ask if she had seen it. There are conversations that happen without voices, ones that speak more through restraint than revelation. That day, Evelyn had one of her rare lucid afternoons. Claire had just finished arranging the pillbox for the week when Evelyn, sitting by the window with her knitting half finished in her lap, suddenly turned her head toward Matthew and smiled. "Elena," she said softly. Matthew froze. He had been sorting through documents on the table beside her, his hand tightened on a page, fingers blanching white. Evelyn looked up at him, eyes clearer than they'd been in days. She used to braid her hair like that, she murmured, her tone floating somewhere between memory and clarity. And she always smelled like oranges. Claire felt her breath catch. Evelyn looked at her now, studying, not with confusion, but recognition. "She's the one, isn't she?" Evelyn asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not the same one, but the one." The room held its breath. Claire turned slowly toward Matthew. He didn't speak, didn't nod, didn't look away. Claire stood still for a moment longer. Then, gently, she reached for Evelyn's knitting needles, folded them onto the table, and offered the older woman a cup of tea. "I think it's time for your break, Mrs. Callahan." Evelyn smiled. "That would be nice." "Dear," later that evening, as the office dimmed and the sky melted into shades of rust and lilac, Claire stood by the window alone. The city moved as always, indifferent and dazzling. She didn't cry, but something inside her felt unmoored, like a boat slowly drifting from a dock it didn't remember tying to. There's a moment when closeness becomes dangerous, not because of what is said, but because of what is felt. Claire knew that moment had arrived. She was not naive. She had seen too many love stories begin in the wrong places, at the wrong times. She had watched people confuse loneliness with destiny. But this was different, and that made it harder. She began to wonder if she had stayed too long in the warmth of this fragile, unexpected world, whether she had started to belong somewhere that wasn't built to keep her. That night, Matthew remained long after the rest of the staff had gone. He stood at his desk, the drawer still closed, but not locked. His hand hovered over it for a long time. Then, slowly, he opened it. The envelope was there. He removed the photograph. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He simply looked for a long, long while. Then he placed the photo face up on the desk, right beside his mother's, no longer hidden. And he sat down in the chair Claire had once said was too rigid for comfort. He didn't leave that night, not until the city outside turned silver with moonlight. Some storms don't come with thunder. They arrive in silence and leave everything broken behind them. It was a Thursday, gray, without drama. The kind of winter day where the sky hangs low like wet wool, and even the wind seems too tired to blow. Claire arrived early, as usual, her boots trailing the thin slush that hadn't yet turned to ice. The office felt quieter than usual. Lights flickered on slowly, one row at a time, coffee brewed, but no one talked much. Just the sound of chairs rolling and keys tapping, filling the air like background static. Evelyn had been quiet that morning. Claire noticed it right away. Her hands shook more than usual. She stared out the window too long, murmured names that didn't belong to anyone in the room. Still. She took her tea. Still. She smiled at Claire's usual question. Feeling lavender or lemon today, but by late morning, something changed. It started with Evelyn forgetting where she was. Then, she forgot who was with her. She began pacing the small corner room, muttering under her breath, her voice brittle and jagged. Claire tried speaking softly. A familiar poem, a line of an old song, but Evelyn wouldn't sit. She turned suddenly and stared at Matthew, who had just entered to check on her. Her face twisted into confusion, then fear, then anger. "You don't belong here," she hissed, pointing at him. Matthew stopped in his tracks. "Mom, it's me." No, you're not." "My husband is coming home. You get out of my house." The last word cracked like a whip. Claire stood, heart racing. She had seen episodes like this before long ago, in care facilities, in hospital beds, but never here. Never with Evelyn. The older woman's face was now flushed with panic. She looked at Claire and, in a voice full of betrayal, cried, "How could you bring him here?" Claire stepped forward, slowly. "Mrs. Callahan, it's Claire. You remember me. We've had tea, talked about the garden." No. Evelyn slapped the air. "You're my daughter. You're supposed to protect me. This is my house. Get out then," in a sudden burst. She hit the edge of the table, knocking the teacup to the floor. It shattered. So did the silence. The office hallway had gone completely still. People stood frozen at their desks. Even the phones seemed to stop ringing. Matthew moved as if to intervene, but Claire gently raised a hand without looking at him. Then she did something no one expected. She sat down, right there on the carpet, cross-legged, calmly, as though this were a perfectly ordinary afternoon. She took a slow breath, closed her eyes, and began to hum. It was a lullaby, soft, old, the kind sung in rocking chairs beside open windows. When time moved slowly and no one rushed sleep, her voice was low, almost a whisper, but sure, a thread in the storm. Evelyn's breathing hitched. She blinked, her lips trembled. Then, like a wave pulling back from shore, her panic receded. She looked down at the broken teacup, at her hands, at Claire, and then she said, with a voice barely audible, "I forgot where I was." Claire stood slowly. "No worries. You're safe now." Evelyn's shoulders slumped. She let Claire guide her back to the chair. Claire wrapped a soft blanket around her and said nothing more. Matthew remained frozen in the doorway, his face unreadable. For a long time, no one moved. The hallway slowly returned to motion, people typing again, conversations rising in murmurs, as though the building itself was exhaling. But something had shifted. A boundary had blurred. Matthew stepped into the room and knelt beside his mother, placing a hand gently on her arm. "I'm here, Mom." She nodded faintly. Already drifting, tired in the way only grief and confusion can make someone tired. Later, when Evelyn slept, her hands still trembling slightly beneath the blanket, Claire turned to leave the room quietly. But Matthew was still there, leaning against the wall, head bowed, breathing shallow. She paused, looked at him. He looked up. His eyes, always composed, were red around the edges, not from crying, but from something close, from restraint, from helplessness. "I should have known this was coming," he whispered. Claire didn't respond with logic, didn't offer clinical explanations or timelines or charts. She simply walked toward him and without words placed her hand gently over his. Her fingers were warm, and for the first time since she had taken the job, there was no distance, no careful professionalism, no roles, just two people standing in the quiet wreckage of something tender and terrifying. Matthew didn't pull away. He didn't speak. He simply let the silence do the work. That night, he didn't go home. He stayed in the office, in the corner room that smelled faintly of chamomile and old pages. Claire brought an extra blanket from the supply closet and curled up on the small couch. Matthew took the chair beside his mother's bed. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp. Outside, the storm had come, not rain, but snow this time, thick and slow, falling like ash in the city below. Evelyn slept, murmuring occasionally. Claire watched the snow fall until her eyes closed. Matthew remained awake the longest. His eyes moved between the two women his past, and whatever this new presence was in his life, he didn't name it, but he no longer pretended it wasn't there. Not all love stories begin with fireworks. Some start with quiet moments like sharing silence without needing to speak. It was subtle, the way things shifted. Lunches that had once been solitary became shared without being planned. Claire would bring an extra sandwich, Matthew would bring coffee. Neither said they were doing it for the other. But both noticed. They started reading to Evelyn together. One page from Whitman, then a few from a gardening magazine. Evelyn smiled more, spoke less, but when she did, it was often to say, "Isn't this nice?" It was, one afternoon, the three of them sat in room 12C while snow pattered against the window like fingertips. Claire read aloud from a novel Evelyn had once loved. Matthew sat beside his mother, eyes half closed, head tilted back. He looked peaceful. Claire hadn't seen him that way before. Later that same day, as Evelyn napped, Claire stayed a little longer than usual. Matthew didn't return to his office. Instead, he brought 2 cups of mint tea and handed one to Claire without a word. They sat side by side on the couch. Outside, the city moved quietly. Claire broke the silence first. "When my sister was dying," she said softly, "she asked me not to be alone after she was gone." Matthew turned his head toward her. "I thought she meant romantically," Claire went on, "but I think now, maybe she just didn't want me to disappear." She looked down at her tea, swirling it gently. She was the brave one. Always louder, always faster to laugh. ALS took everything from her, except her honesty. "I wasn't brave enough to stay in that house after she passed, so I left nursing. I left everything." She didn't cry, but the words felt like something heavy, finally put down. Matthew listened, really listened. Then he said, "I think I've been hiding behind this company, pretending the silence is just part of the job." Claire looked up. He met her gaze. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a quiet truth, laid gently between them like folded linens. He spoke again, this time more carefully. "If I asked you to stay, not just as my assistant, what would you say?" Claire didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. She turned slightly toward him, and gave the smallest nod, soft, steady, unmistakable. And then she leaned back beside him, letting the silence return, but this time it was full, not empty. That night, the office felt warmer somehow. Evelyn was content. Claire was calm. Matthew was something he hadn't been in years, still at peace, as if the wind had finally settled after years of knocking at the windows. The next morning, Claire arrived early again. The sky was pale gold, and frost traced the edges of the lobby glass. She carried 2 bagel cinnamon for her, plain for Matthew. When she opened her email, there it was. A message from St. Francis Medical Center, a job offer, not just any job, a leadership position in palliative care, full benefits, salary double what she earned now. Claire stared at the screen for a long time. Then, without hesitation, she closed the tab, didn't delete it, didn't respond, just closed it, and slipped her phone back into her bag as Matthew walked in with coffee. He smiled at her. She smiled back. No words, but something in the air said, "This is not over yet." Claire never meant to stay. She came for a paycheck. She stayed for something she never expected belonging. But belonging, she was learning, was a dangerous kind of comfort, the kind that made you hesitate, that made you question whether staying was love or just fear of letting go. The email sat unopened for days. Sometimes she'd hover her thumb over it, her heart thudding in her chest, then swipe it away like a mosquito she couldn't quite kill. Other times, she'd imagine replying thank you for the offer. I'm honored, maybe next time, but she never clicked, never typed, just thought. On a Monday that began with cold drizzle and a flickering light above the copy machine, Claire sat alone in her corner and opened a blank document. She didn't even title it. She began typing, "Dear Matthew, I want to thank you for the opportunity to work with you and your team. These months have changed me more than I expected. I've decided to accept a new position. This isn't because I'm unhappy here. It's because I think it's time. Please take care of Evelyn and yourself warmly. Claire." She stared at it for several minutes. Then she hit delete. The screen went blank. She started again. This time, it was longer, softer. It included a paragraph about how Evelyn had become like family, how the office had given her a kind of peace she hadn't thought she deserved. Then she printed it, held it in her hands, then folded it in thirds and tucked it into the back of her notebook next to her sister's old recipe for banana bread. That night, Evelyn had a good spell, her mind clear as glass. She was humming when Claire brought in tea. "You know," she said suddenly, looking up with eyes that sparkled with something familiar, "I always imagined my son would marry someone like you." Claire paused mid-step. Evelyn smiled. "You're kind. You listen. And you bring light into rooms without needing to open windows." Claire tried to speak, but something inside her broke quietly, without sound. She sank to the edge of the bed and let Evelyn hold her hand. "I'm not sure he knows yet," Evelyn added softly. "But that's all right. Some men take a little longer to catch up." Claire smiled through blurred vision. That night, she didn't open her email. The next morning, everything cracked. It started with a casual hallway conversation. One of the younger team members, while grabbing coffee, casually mentioned to Matthew, "I heard Claire got a job offer. Big one. From a hospital, I think." He hadn't meant harm. But words don't always need sharp edges to cut. Matthew said nothing, just gave a quiet "oh" and walked away. That afternoon, he skipped lunch with Claire, didn't stop by room 12C, didn't say goodnight when he left. Claire noticed. She noticed the silence where warmth had been, the absence of questions, the distance. She didn't bring it up, not that day. The next morning, Evelyn was restless. She kept pacing the small room, murmuring about the photograph. She couldn't find it. Claire checked every drawer, every book, every corner. "What if it's gone?" Evelyn whispered, eyes wide with panic. "What if someone took it?" Claire tried to soothe her, but nothing worked. Not tea, not music, not soft words. By afternoon, Evelyn was crying, not loudly worse. the quiet, aching kind of cry that sounds like regret. Matthew arrived halfway through. He looked at his mother, then at Claire, and something inside him snapped not violently, but with quiet disappointment. "You were supposed to keep things in order," he said, voice low. This was the one thing that mattered to her. Claire's mouth opened, but she didn't defend herself. She just looked at him, not as an employee, but as someone who, in another life, might have stayed. She left the room without a word, and when the sun began to set, Claire began packing. Just a few things: her notebook, her mug, the cardigan she kept draped over her chair, the letter she had written but never sent. She placed it in her bag, still folded, still unread. She didn't say goodbye, just moved slowly through the office, each step a small betrayal of the place she had allowed herself to love. The building hummed with evening light. Outside, the streets were beginning to glow with headlights and early frost. Inside, Claire paused at the doorway of room 12C. Evelyn was sleeping. Matthew wasn't there. Claire stood quietly for a moment longer, then closed the door. Some proposals don't come with candles or music. They come in the quiet spaces where love grew slowly, silently, deeply. It was a Saturday. Denver had fallen under a soft, silvery snow, that morning steady, unhurried, like the sky itself was remembering how to exhale. Claire arrived late, for once. She wasn't on the schedule. There were no deadlines to meet, but the office had become a second skin, and some habits like making sure Evelyn had her favorite blanket, or watering the plant on Matthew's windowsill were hard to break. When she walked into the lobby, James was there, her older brother. She blinked. "What are you doing here?" James grinned, holding Evelyn's coat gently over one arm. "I'm kidnapping your favorite boss lady for the afternoon," he said. "Museum, hot chocolate, some gossip, doctor's orders, Claire's doctor, in case you're wondering." Evelyn appeared from around the corner, cheeks pink with excitement. "Your brother's very charming," she said. "I hope you're not planning to keep him to yourself." Claire raised an eyebrow at James, who just winked and offered Evelyn his arm. As they headed toward the exit, Claire called after them. "Don't let her talk you into ballroom dancing." "Too late," Evelyn shouted back, and then they were gone. Claire turned slowly, stepping into the elevator alone. When the doors opened at the 12th floor, the silence felt intentional. Room 12C's door was ajar. The hallway, usually echoing with footsteps or the faint sound of Evelyn humming, was quiet, thick with stillness. Inside the room, something had changed. Gone were the everyday items: the tea cart, the reading lamp, the half-finished puzzle. In their place, something simple, something sacred. A single table stood near the window, covered in soft linen. On it rested a framed blueprint, Claire's first design draft at Callahan Design Group, the one she had sketched by hand, her second week on the job, long before she had learned the unspoken rules of Matthew's world: messy, imperfect, but full of feeling. Next to it, the photograph Evelyn always kept on her nightstand, the one of her wedding day, slightly faded, framed in worn silver. And then, Matthew. He was standing by the window. No suit today, no tie, just a navy sweater and quiet eyes. Claire didn't speak, didn't move. He turned when he heard her footsteps. A long silence passed before either said a word. "I didn't know how else to say it," he began, his voice lower than usual. "So, I thought I'd show it." Claire looked around the room. Every detail felt like a whisper of their shared history. The chair where Evelyn used to sit. The lamp Claire had once fixed when no one else noticed it was flickering. And the blueprint. She walked slowly toward the table, fingertips brushing the edge of the frame. "I thought you threw this out," she said softly. "I almost did," he replied. "Twice." She turned to face him. He stepped forward, closing the distance slowly. "You didn't just bring my mother back to me," he said, his voice catching slightly. "You brought me back, the part of me I thought I buried with Elena." Claire looked down. Matthew continued. "You sat beside grief and didn't flinch. You didn't try to fix it, you just stayed. And somehow, in that staying, I remembered how to feel again. He paused. Then, quietly, he said, "If you'd still have me, I'd like to try. Not as your boss, not even as someone who knows the right words." He opened his palm. In it was a simple silver ring. Not flashy, not large, just elegant, quiet, like her. No stage, no audience. He said, "Just this room." The room where everything changed. Claire didn't answer right away. She looked past him, toward the large windows where snow was falling in soft, dizzy spirals over Denver's rooftops. Then, slowly, she took his hand and led him toward the balcony. The cold greeted them gently. The city below was hushed beneath a white hush, lights blinking like slow heartbeats. The railing was dusted with powdery snow, untouched. They stood side by side. Claire took a breath, then said, "Yes." A pause. Then she added, "But slowly, with no secrets this time." Matthew nodded, his shoulders softened, and then, because there was nothing else to say, they stood together, watching the city exhale. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. Some answers don't arrive with music or sudden heat. Some arrive in the way a heart stops holding its breath. When they stepped back inside, Evelyn was there. Claire gasped softly. "I told James I wanted to come back early," Evelyn said with a wink. "Told him I had a feeling something important was going to happen." She looked between the two of them, her gaze sharp despite the fading clarity of her days. Then she smiled. "I told you she was the one," Matthew chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck like a boy caught stealing cookies. Claire blushed. Evelyn stepped closer, reached for Claire's hand, and squeezed it. "Welcome to the family," she whispered. The snow that winter fell quietly, like a blessing from the sky, like a mother's final gift. They didn't plan a big wedding. There were no engraved invitations, no guest list beyond the office, no elaborate floral arrangements, just room 12C, dressed in soft white linen and garlands of eucalyptus that Claire had braided herself the night before. The old bookshelf had been cleared to make space for a small cake. Evelyn's teacups were used for champagne. The chairs from the conference room were brought in and lined neatly in 2 rows. The room smelled faintly of vanilla and printer paper. It was perfect. The snow outside had blanketed Denver in a soft hush. The streets were empty. The city slowed down like the world was holding its breath for something sacred. Evelyn had woken early that morning, clear-eyed, steady. She insisted on wearing a navy blue dress with pearl buttons, one that Claire had never seen before. "It was my engagement dress," Evelyn said, smoothing the fabric with shaking fingers. "It still fits. Mostly." Claire helped her button it slowly, listening as Evelyn hummed softly under her breath. "You know," Evelyn whispered as she fastened a simple locket around her neck. "Your father would have liked her." Claire blinked. "My father?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "Well, you're my daughter now, aren't you?" And just like that, the tears came. Later, when the music began, an old instrumental piece Evelyn had requested, she stood beside Claire at the edge of the makeshift aisle. Everyone stood as they walked. There was no crowd, but it felt like a cathedral, the air thick with quiet reverence, the kind of hush only love can create. Matthew waited near the windows, hands clasped, tie slightly crooked. He didn't smile at first. He just looked, as though taking her in with the full weight of years and quiet mornings and all the things neither of them had said out loud. Claire's dress was simple ivory lace, long sleeves, no veil. She wore her sister's necklace, and her mother's ring on one hand, Evelyn's bracelet on the other. When she reached Matthew, she turned and kissed Evelyn gently on the cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. Evelyn nodded, then sat, her hands folded in her lap. The ceremony was short. No officiant, just a colleague from HR who used to be a pastor. No choir, just a Bluetooth speaker that glitched once during the vows. And yet, it felt timeless. Matthew took Claire's hands. His voice shook slightly. I once thought success meant building something people would remember, but I was wrong. Success means nothing if I can't share it with you. Claire didn't reply with words. She just squeezed his hands once, then twice, like saying me too, me always. They kissed softly, and the room, despite being a workplace, felt entirely like home. Afterward, there were cookies and cider, laughter. James told embarrassing childhood stories. The interns took blurry Polaroids. Evelyn sat near the window the entire time, sipping ginger tea. She didn't speak much, but every so often, she'd look at Claire and smile as though satisfied, as though something had settled inside her at last. That night, after everyone had gone and the cleanup was halfway done, Evelyn went to bed early. Claire tucked her in with extra care. Matthew lingered by the doorway. "She's tired," Claire said. He nodded. "I think she was waiting to see this day," Claire added softly. He looked at her, something tender moving behind his eyes. And for the first time in a long time, Claire saw what hope looked like, not the kind you chase, but the kind that arrives quietly when you finally stop running. But just before dawn, the call came, a soft knock at their door. James, looking pale. "It's Mom," he said. Evelyn had had a mild heart attack, nothing catastrophic but enough to shake the edges of their new peace. By the time they reached the hospital, she was stable, hooked to machines, but conscious. Her first words were, "Did I miss the honeymoon?" Claire laughed through tears. "No, you're just early to breakfast." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Good, I still have stories to tell." But as the snow kept falling that week, it became clear her strength was fading. She was still Evelyn, still present, but softer now, as though each breath took more effort, as though her soul was already beginning to pack gently for its final journey. 5 years later, the light in that little room still glows every evening, as if Evelyn never truly left. They call it the Evelyn Room now. What was once a spare office with mismatched chairs and a chipped teacup became a quiet refuge, a space for rest, for pause, for remembering. Employees drop in during lunch breaks. New hires sit there on their first day. Sometimes, no one speaks, and that's okay. The lamp still stands by the window, the same one Claire fixed all those years ago. A small plaque beside the door reads, "Kindness lives here." It had been Matthew's idea to name it after his mother, but it was Claire who gave it a soul. Evelyn passed away one spring evening, just as the cherry blossoms were beginning to bloom near City Park. She had fallen asleep with Claire's hand in hers, and June's toy bear tucked gently under her blanket. James had been there, so had several longtime employees. No one was hurried, no one cried loudly. There was only soft music, warm tea, and a sense that Evelyn had waited until everything was right before letting go. She left behind no demands, no dramatic last words, just a room, a story, and a ripple that would never stop moving outward. In the months that followed, Matthew launched the Evelyn Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping companies across Colorado create in-office care spaces for aging loved ones. What started with one room became 20, then 40, then partnerships with hospitals and local community centers. You don't have to choose between your job and your family. The mission statement read, "You shouldn't have to." Claire became the foundation's ambassador, her quiet presence and soft-spoken strength helping others believe that care could be both professional and deeply personal. At Callahan Design Group, she was now COO, but at home, she was just Mom. June Evelyn Callahan had her grandmother's laugh. She was 4 now, with a shock of curly brown hair and a love for crayons and peanut butter crackers. Most afternoons, after preschool, she'd toddle into the Evelyn room with her markers and blanket. She'd sit in the same chair Evelyn once favored and hum to herself while drawing stories. Claire would peek in sometimes, watching from the doorway. She never interrupted. Once, she asked June what she was drawing. June said, "It's a picture of Grandma Evelyn holding the moon." Claire didn't ask what that meant. She just kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered, "That sounds exactly right." One rainy Thursday, while organizing the bookshelf in the Evelyn room, Claire found an old poetry book wedged between the cushions. It was one of Evelyn's. Inside, tucked between the pages, was a folded envelope, yellowed with time, handwritten. Claire froze. She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter written in Evelyn's soft cursive. If you're reading this, it means I finally left. But remember, I never left your hearts. You've built something beautiful. And I don't just mean the office. I mean the way you care, the way you hold space for each other, the way you remember that people matter more than profit. Matthew, thank you for letting me stay, for loving me even when I forgot how to love myself. Claire, thank you for being brave, for staying when it was easier to run, for choosing softness when the world demanded steel. And little June, if you're old enough to read this someday, know that your Grandma Evelyn loved you before you were born. Keep the light on, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Love always. Claire didn't cry, not right away. She just sat in the quiet room, letter on her lap, one hand resting on the curve of the old teacup Evelyn used to favor. The lamp flickered once, then glowed steady. Later that night, Claire read the letter to Matthew. They didn't speak for a long time after, just sat on the living room floor with June asleep upstairs and the dishwasher humming softly in the background. Then Matthew whispered, "She left more than memories." Claire nodded. She left the way forward. The story of Evelyn Callahan became more than a footnote. It became part of the company's DNA. Every orientation began with a story not about architecture or clients, but about the day a woman in a nightgown wandered into the lobby holding a photo of her son. They called it the kindness origin. And every December, on Evelyn's birthday, the company closed for a full day, not for holiday shopping or bonuses, but to serve. Employees volunteered at senior centers, donated to hospice homes, wrote letters to elders in the community. June would help decorate the Evelyn room with cutout stars and strings of soft lights. She'd tape her drawings to the windows and say, "Grandma will like this one." And Claire, she no longer wondered if she should have taken that other job. She no longer looked for something better, because she had built something whole out of grief, out of quiet love, out of the long, slow act of staying. Evelyn had taught her that, had taught them all, and every evening, as the sun dipped below the Denver skyline, the lamp in the Evelyn room flicked on whether someone was there or not. Because some lights don't go out. They stay, like memory, like love, like the echo of one soft act of kindness that never stopped growing. Sometimes, it's not the grand gestures that change our lives, but the quiet ones. A warm cup of tea, a hand held in silence, a moment of being truly seen. This story reminds us that even in the deepest grief, healing can begin with the simplest act of kindness. That love doesn't always arrive with fireworks. It often comes gently, after loss, after silence, after years of simply enduring. For those of us who have lived long enough to lose, to ache, to sit beside empty chairs and folded photographs, this story is a gentle whisper. It's never too late. It's never too late to forgive. Never too late to start again. Never too late to open your heart softly, slowly to something new. What we build with care, we pass on not just through our words, but through the way we love, the way we listen, and the spaces we make for others to feel safe. Because in the end, the greatest legacy we leave behind may not be found in what we earned, but in who felt held in our presence. Thank you for spending your time with us, and for letting this story into your heart. If it touched you even in a small way, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue telling stories that heal, connect, and remind us of what truly matters. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself and each other.